Hi, my name is Amy Merrill,
And I'm Croix Laconsay.
and this is Scientists Talk Movies.
Hi, Amy.
Hi, Croix.
We're in the same lab, but I know some of your background. But tell me about how you got interested in science.
It wasn't necessarily the most straight path. So, growing up, I wanted to be a writer actually. And ever since I could put sentences together, first grade or so, I wanted to be a fiction writer. And so I was pretty anti-science in that aspect. And it wasn't until eighth grade where, we had a section on chemistry where I really started to think oh, maybe I could actually do this. And for me, it was this kind of fantasy of potions class mixed with the problem solving and critical thinking and all of that together, which I really enjoyed. And one of the interests that I had in science was putting science and philosophy together, and what is the role of science in our society and what purpose does it serve? And so I think for me, a lot of science fiction movies kind of deal with these greater questions of humanity or how science affects humanity, either in the fact that the science is currently there, or it's projecting into the future of maybe science that isn't quite here yet, but 10, 20 years out, it will be there. You also have a common interest in science and philosophy, and we often talk about that in relating to our research. So I was wondering how you got interested in becoming a scientist.
I think I also have an unconventional path to science. I also wasn't the kid that was always searching and collecting bugs or super curious. I was always running around and playing. And I was particularly drawn to math when I was in elementary school and middle school. I hated reading, I hated writing, and I love that now, which is kind of ironic, but I think it was in high school when I took my first chemistry class, and I don't know why, but I enjoyed doing the stoichiometry problems and learning about acid-base chemistry. And I also kind of liked, we got an introduction to drawing structures, just really base level organic chemistry, drawing Lewis structures. I really liked that. Maybe it tapped into my artistic side if I had one. So I enjoyed that, and I knew I wanted to major in chemistry when I went off to college. So I did that. Didn't like general chemistry as much in college, to be honest. But then I took organic chemistry, and my professor, she was amazing, made me fall in love with organic chemistry. She did the classic chalk on the chalkboard, drawing line structures, organic reaction mechanisms. And that's what drew me to organic chemistry. And I stepped into the wet lab and I was a mess. I spilled chemicals everywhere. I think one class I actually dropped like 8 or so dangerous chemicals, and my professor took me aside and was like, "It's okay, we all do that, right? At some point, you should talk to this professor, Professor Galbraith, our physical chemistry professor. He does computational chemistry. You might like that. You really like chemistry. You seem to enjoy organic chemistry. Why don't you do computational organic chemistry?" And that's what led me to doing a graduate degree in computational organic chemistry. I never thought I would be doing this, 10 years ago, but I think, like you mentioned, I also have an interest in philosophy, and in college I was debating whether or not to do philosophy or chemistry, but I think my love for chemistry trumped my love for philosophy. But I still like thinking about that.
I think I was also really interested in solving problems and puzzles. And to me, chemistry was just a lot of thinking of creatively about solving problems. What I do currently with NMR, I think of as a puzzle.
Our life is just puzzles, problem solving, and
yeah.
If any, what particular movies might have further enhanced your desire to pursue science?
Yeah, so when I was in high school, I took an AP biology course, and at the end of the year, we had kind of a dead week, so we just watched sci-fi movies or movies about science the entire week. And there were two movies in particular which kind of stuck with me. The first was Gattaca, which is about genetically modifying people and a society that is based on what if most of the people in the society were genetically modified. And the second was Outbreak, which is about a pandemic. And it's interesting because, in high school, it wasn't so much of a reality, but there's kind of this idea we could face a pandemic in the future, and now we are. And the movie is based in Northern California, which is where we are now at UC Davis. And so it's just interesting how it's come full circle, and these kind of questions of how the role of science in society. In Outbreak, it's, can we sacrifice the few for the many, or should we quarantine off this small town to save the rest of the country? And we're not dealing with an outbreak that is as deadly as in the movie, where the level of deadliness is about the same as like Ebola. So think of people dying very quickly, and they had to quarantine people very strictly. We're still dealing with a lot of these questions in today's world. And then Gattaca is more philosophical in that, like, what does it mean to be human? And so the main character, Vincent, he is naturally born, or he's an invalid, as they call them in the movie. And so valid humans are ones that have been genetically modified from birth. And, kind of the fiction aspect of this is that they can control everything about a human from their genetics. And so when a person is born, they know exactly when and how they're going to die. It goes as far as that. So that's kind of the fiction portion.
I have seen Gattaca. I haven't seen Outbreak, though. It's kind of scary. When I watched that movie, I kept thinking about CRISPR, the technology co-discovered by Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel. I keep thinking about, I was just listening to an interview of Jennifer Doudna talking about CRISPR, and I like the fact that she talks about, or keeps thinking about, the ethical issues that are tied to this technology, gene editing, and I can't stop thinking about that as well. And I hope that scientists are, when they discover something that's really impactful, maybe think down the road what implications might change the world significantly. I mean, Gattaca, right, seems like a kind of worst case scenario for some gene editing technology. Do you think about that when you do your science? Were you thinking about CRISPR at all in Gattaca?
Yeah, I think when I first saw the movie in high school, that technology wasn't quite there, but it was going in that direction. And so that's kind of why I think they made the movie. And I think that's kind of the amazing role that movies have in science, is this ability to storytell and give a perspective that maybe as scientists talking about science, we don't always get to have, in that there's this kind of storytelling aspect where you can see things from the perspective of people that were positively influenced by this gene editing, or the valid people who had pretty much whatever opportunity they wanted available to them, or from the main character's perspective, Vincent, who wanted to become an astronaut and couldn't because of his genes. With
Vincent he's the invalid, right?
Yes.
And Jerome was the valid that he pretended to be. It was interesting as a caste system, having genetically modified humans being the superior group of people, and then it's, like I said, again, a worst case scenario. I think this was a I hope it was kind of a warning to scientists and philosophers of science to think about these issues.
In our science, it can be difficult to look at kind of these bigger pictures because we do a lot of computational work on small molecules. But the question I had for you is, how do you see scientists or society putting together organizations or problem solving to look at the effects of this science and technology that we're dealing with today? Because it does create new problems that haven't been foreseen in past societies.
I can imagine some global organization like the World Health Organization with scientists and philosophers that actually sit down at a table and maybe think of the ethical issues or moral issues regarding some sort of new discovery that is facing our planet. Kind of like organizations that think about climate change on a daily basis.
So we talked about how in Gattaca, these genetically modified individuals were enhanced and like highly sought after, but in the movie Blade Runner, it's kind of the opposite is true. And so I was wondering if you could speak to Blade Runner.
Oh yeah, I first watched that in college in a philosophy of mind class, and we were talking about that movie in the context of artificial intelligence and what is consciousness. But rewatching it now recently made me start to rethink about some of those questions. And I just like the movie for its kind of artistic. It's very cinematic and kind of has those cyberpunk aspects to it, and it's just very visually appealing. Some people think the dialogue's pretty boring, and when I first watched it, it was too dark in I guess there was a glare on the screen and I couldn't actually like watch it seriously. But watching it recently, I realized how beautiful and artistic the actual movie is. I think Scott Ridley did a good job, has Harrison Ford. But I think this movie, unlike some other science fiction movies, really asks some really deep philosophical questions that I never really thought about before.
Yeah, I thought, well, the movie gets pretty dark towards the end, but essentially in this world, they have manufactured humans. So they have been genetically modified, but there's kind of this idea that they're machine made instead of born, whereas in Gattaca, they're more still born, or you get the sense that they're still born. These, what did they call it? Degenerates?
Yeah. Or replicas?
Yes.
Was it replicas?
Yes, it was replicas. The replicas aren't seen as fully human in this world, whereas in Gattaca, they're kind of superhuman. So I think there's an interesting juxtaposition with these two movies. But yeah, I think both movies deal with what does it mean to be human and to truly live, whereas these machine-made individuals in Blade Runner, they aren't seen as fully alive or fully human. However, as you come to find in the movie, they do end up wanting to have a life and fall in love. And the two replicas that they focus on in the movie, they fell in love, but they have kind of this ticking time bomb on them where they started making replicas that only live 4 years. And so essentially they're born as adults and they implant memories that kind of stabilize them as humans. And then after 4 years, they die. And so these two individuals, they're trying to have a life essentially, even though the society doesn't really see their life as truly human.
Wasn't Rachel one of the two replicas that I guess ended up falling in love with Deckard? I think people discuss whether or not Deckard was a replica, but Rachel was a replica. Did you see her humanity? Or?
Yeah, so it's interesting how they phrased Rachel because they don't make it totally clear if she's a replicant or not. So Deckard, who's the main character, and he's a Blade Runner because he essentially goes after and kills these replicants if they go off the charts or something like that, if they're not doing what they're told. He does a test to determine if people are human or naturally born, or if they're replicants and machine made. And with Rachel, her test takes about an hour and a half, and usually they take around 10 minutes. And so it's very hard to tell if she's been manufactured or not. But so it's interesting that you say they kind of leave this question open or don't make it explicit if the main character is a replicant himself. But in the sequel to Blade Runner, so 2049, they do actually answer that question. So he is a replicant, and Rachel's unique in that she's able to have a child, and kind of more pushing towards this idea that they are fully human, even if they've been manufactured.
I haven't seen the sequel. I need to see that. Yeah, was it good?
So I actually watched the sequel first, so I was a little confused as to what happens. And I think they kind of mirrored the thematically how the tempo of the original movie, if that makes sense. And that the first half is really slow. There's a lot of beautiful imagery and just images of these skylines in Los Angeles and San Diego and Las Vegas, of just skyscrapers everywhere, and how the society has evolved, because Earth has essentially become a manufacturing place for these replicants, and any humans that could afford to do so have left Earth. And in the second half of the movie, they get more into this question of, what does it mean to be human, and the plot line definitely increases dramatically, and you kind of see this tension building in both movies in the second half. So I thought it was interesting how in the sequel they very much mirrored the original movie.
Do you think LA in 2049 will look like that? No, I think a common theme in science fiction movies in the 80s and even now is to depict a futuristic world. The 1982 Blade Runner wasn't. It's kind of funny to watch that now in 2020 and knowing that that movie took place in 2019 in LA. I guess, to what extent do you think science fiction movies seriously try to depict a realistic future city like Los Angeles?
I think in the aspect of storytelling, they can kind of go crazy in that, okay, this is 2049, but maybe to get to a city that's as overgrown and just skyscrapers everywhere with just kind of no forests or trees to be seen. I think in our minds, we see this as maybe like a 3049 movie. So 1,000 years from now, we might get to that place. But I think it's still the technology aspect, and that, I think the genetic engineering, there's always some kind of truth to the science fiction, and that we're kind of moving in that direction.
I loved how in Blade Runner there was kind of in the beginning, there's this thing that floats above the city, and it's a generally dark film. It's kind of like noir, and there in Blade Runner, what really stood out to me when I was watching it for the first time was that just weird spotlight sound that went vroom, vroom. And it kind of made me think about why Scott decided to put that spotlight in there. I have no idea why he would do that. I think that was a very interesting artistic choice. I'm sure there was a reason why, and some probably symbolic reason why he did that.
It almost reminds me of the green light in The Great Gatsby. I hadn't thought about the spot like that before, but maybe just kind of this nod to that maybe, and like the American dream and how it's kind of out there in space in this movie.
Okay. Do you think the spotlight represented the space dream in a way? I mean, in Gattaca too, right? The goal of everyone there was to become astronauts to literally get off the planet. So it's kind of an interesting parallel.
I think maybe it did. I think that's kind of an interesting nod to the science as well, in that the science kind of allowed them to leave Earth in both movies.
What do you think is the next big thing, or perhaps in chemistry at least? Do you have a sense of where our field is going? And
yeah, so I think in the field of organic chemistry, there's a lot of talk of AI, or in organic synthesis, we're starting to move to more automation, both in how we think about synthetic routes with AI, or you can use a computer to siphon out papers and figure out the best plan to a chemical. And also we can use machines to make these chemicals a lot faster, or in medicinal chemistry, sometimes you want to screen hundreds of compounds. So they're starting to develop machines to quickly make those compounds automatically, which helps to reduce the hazards to chemists. But I think there will be some interesting both literature and hopefully films kind of dealing with that aspect of science in the future, in that chemistry is becoming more automated, but that could also lead to hazards.
do you think movies do a good job of depicting scientists and chemists? Do they do an accurate job? Like, is it an accurate depiction of? I personally don't think so.
Usually scientists in movie are kind of portrayed as really out there, and maybe, there's this idea of the crazy scientists or the crazy chemists.
Alone in the lab with no lights.
So in Gattaca, they don't really focus much on the scientists. They're kind of in the background. But in Blade Runner, there is, in the second half of the movie, they go to one of the genetic engineers' penthouses. It's very kind of almost creepy, and that there are a lot of dolls everywhere. And he can relate to the plight of these replicants, because he also has a condition that's going to shorten his lifespan. But it's also like a very, in my opinion, creepy image of a scientist. In today's media, scientists are portrayed a lot more normal.
I think there's a lot of work we could do with, representing women scientists and people of color. But, historically, it seems to be, old white men that are the scientists. So hopefully that changes.
I think it's interesting how there's kind of almost two versions of scientists in media, where there's this like crazy, doesn't completely, off the charts, doesn't have anything together, or there's like the very well put together scientist that always has the answer, like sometimes takes years to get a good paper or to solve a proof that you really want to have.
I think chemistry tends to scare people away. I feel like organic chemistry and general chemistry tend to be seen as the weed out class, and that then puts some stigma on the courses to stay away. They're difficult courses that people are just trying to trudge through, and I do think there is a need for some improvement in the curriculum.
What role do you think movies have in that aspect, or in changing that narrative?
In my opinion, I don't think they help. I think more representation of chemists and happy chemists.
I know I mentioned Outbreak at the beginning of this, and I think how they portray scientists is kind of more honest view, and that it's supposed to be in real time and they have to come up with a cure. And maybe the timeline is a little bit too fast for reality, but I think they do a good job of looking at the questions that scientists or doctors deal with on a daily basis or in their work. In this case, in a pandemic.
Was it a group of scientists searching for a vaccine?
So they were trying to find a cure, I believe, rather than a vaccine. It's been a while since I watched the movie, but essentially the virus is so dangerous that they just shut down the whole town. Nobody is allowed to get in or out. And there's this kind of scare that maybe the virus will get out of the small town in California and then it'll start to affect the whole society. So kind of the fiction aspect is the way that they deal with it is the US government then decides, okay, we need to just bomb this town and get rid of everybody and the whole virus. And that might be a little bit unrealistic, but I think this idea of quarantining people off and not letting them leave, that could actually happen in real life. So the scientists, there's a lot of pressure on them to cure these people. They think their lives are valuable. They think the people that they're working with, their lives are valuable and worth saving. But it's like, at what cost? Do you save the entire country but sacrifice a few people? It's kind of the scientific question they're dealing with.
Well, I think this was a great conversation. I'm glad we talked about Gattaca and Blade Runner. Those are awesome movies. I feel like the viewers should watch Blade Runner just for the final scene. Do you remember what the replicant said? That's so good. I've seen things you people wouldn't believe, Roy says. Attack ships on fire at the shoulder of Orion. I watched sea beams glitter in the dark near the Tannhauser Gate. All those moments will be lost in time, like tears in rain. Just watch it for that. It's great. Yeah, well, thanks, Amy. I had fun
Thanks, Croix.
Chatting with you. We should do this more when we're back in lab.
Yes, always fun to talk science and philosophy and movies.
Absolutely.
And to listeners at home, thanks for tuning in, and be sure to check us out next time on Scientists Talk Movies.